So we start this particular passage from John during Mark's cycle to fill in those vacant Sundays where there wasn't enough Mark to fill in, but also because there is no comprehensive, I don't want to say that, that's not right. There's no retelling of the Eucharistic narrative in the Gospel of John. If we go to the narrative around the Last Supper in the Gospel of John, we do not find Eucharistic theology as such. We find instead Jesus' command to service and to self-giving love. So it's the washing of the feet. It is the what we call Jesus' last discourse, where he talks about love, and no greater love hath one than to lay down one's life for one's friends, et cetera, et cetera. All of that is in the Last Supper discourse in John. And so it takes on the form. Now, here's where our form critics get involved in New Testament work. It takes the form of a last will and testament, which we get from every major Old Testament figure. You get one from Moses, you get one from Joshua, you get one, et cetera. You can go through the Old Testament, the great prophets like Elijah. You get this last will and testament, this handing on of the tradition. That's what John does during the Last Supper discourse. And there's no Eucharistic focus that you get in the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, where you get the narrative. Jesus took bread, broke the bread, gave it to his disciples, and said, "This is my body," et cetera, et cetera. You don't get that in John anywhere, actually. However, it is this 6th chapter, which, as we look at John's gospel as a whole, forms what is essentially John's Eucharistic theology. So what the church does during this B cycle of the lectionary is take the opportunity to fill in those vacant Sundays where we don't have enough Mark to go around, and then takes the opportunity to look at this 6th chapter of John. So for the next few weeks, actually, I think it's the next 3, maybe 4 weeks, we will go through this chapter, which is 50 some verses long, I think. When does this end? Let me give a quick look-see here. This doesn't end until the middle of August. So
71 verses.
Yeah, there's a lot. How many do we use, though? That's what I'm trying to figure out here real quick. I'm looking through my commentary.
First reading is 21.
Yeah, it goes through verse 58. I know that. That's what I was thinking of. Which is going to be, no, it goes all the way through to 69. Yeah. So it goes all the way through to the end of August.
Yep.
So we're going to really beat this horse.
Okay.
But there are some really cool theological principles, some really cool pastoral underpinnings to a number of things in the church. Because again, what are we talking about? We're talking about the bread of life. That's the real core here. It's all built around this saying that Jesus has, which are frequent in the Gospel of John. We have these sayings in John. I call them the great I ams, where Jesus makes John leads up to this, and then Jesus makes a pronouncement. He says, in this case, he says, "I am the bread of life." We've already talked about that way back in Eastertide a little bit when we said, "I am the good shepherd." There's another one there, see? Mm-hmm. And each of these great statements is followed by a great sign, or a miracle. We might call it a miracle, which is what we're going to talk a little bit about today in terms of the place of miracles. And they are illustrative of Jesus' nature as the Son of God, and also then have implications for the mission of the church. So as George has frequently said John was not writing for the common man. He was writing for some bunch of Greek philosophers somewhere. But also we begin to realize that by even dating John's gospel, which is very late when it comes to the canonical gospels, it's the last written, John has had the opportunity to really reflect on a theological way, which, given just what we did pre-opening of our meeting here, our discussion is basically needs to be rooted in philosophy. Because what it does is then take the experience, the spiritual experience of Jesus, and tries to explain it in ways that human knowledge can understand. Those categories of human knowledge are preformed. They are already in us relative to our historical period, the state of human knowledge, all that sort of thing. So John is taking his experience of the risen Lord, both pre and post resurrection, and the phenomenon of discipleship, the following, the growing Jesus movement, as it were, and trying to set it down in ways that human understanding would then be able to accept. Not accept in the sense of argumentation, but accept from point of view of make it understandable. That if you became a person of faith, you could understand what John was talking about. So faith can't think of the word, is, I got a fancy word, propedeutic. Faith is necessary, a preliminary to actually coming to an understanding of John. John's gospel is definitely a document of faith, because it is primarily a theological statement. So you get the beginning that we've referred to so many times, that prologue that we read on the Mass on Christmas Day. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. That concept, logos, is a primary Greek philosophical concept, because the logos is the organizing principle of all of the created order in Greek philosophy, the Word. And so John uses this because of Old Testament use of this concept, the Word. We go back to Genesis, for example. God spake, and he spake, let there be light, and there was light, and so on. So that John sort of takes that and then adds Greek philosophy to it as a common denominator, and then is able then to expand into the Greek mind what this Jewish Jesus was all about. Kathy, you look like you want to say something.
No, I'm digesting, thinking, and so far, the one thing that I was thinking though was that how many, for lack of a better term, peasants really knew much about Greek philosophy.
Well, some.
Yeah, some, but it was not
they wouldn't have had a discourse about it, but
yeah.
It would have been the mindset in which they had been reared.
That's true, yes.
Okay. So like in our modern day, for example, our modern day mindset is primarily based in skepticism. Why is that? It goes back to the Enlightenment, back to the 18th century, where reason became the primary modus operandi of the thinking class. And then that's what bore out the scientific method. And so the idea is you ask questions. And so unquestioning acceptance of things is not considered normative. We have a little bit of that going on in some of our political philosophy and so on. But we see that for the most part in modern culture as contrary to human nature. contrary to our human mind, or a healthy human mind. In the modern philosophical construct, a healthy skepticism is the starting point. In other words, we want you to be curious. We want you to ask questions. We want you to, quote unquote, find out for yourself. Even parents do that sometimes. There's a big debate in parenting, for example, right now. Is there too much protection of our young people so that they don't experience struggle? If you don't experience struggle, how can you become resilient in the face of disappointment and pain and suffering and so on? And if you can't be resilient in the face of pain and suffering, can you genuinely be compassionate? Because you've not experienced pain and struggle in your own life. And so there's a deficit, as I read a lot of this information, and it goes beyond just parenting. It goes, that by parenting, I'm sort of criticizing the concept of helicopter parenting, where, parents are just so afraid that their children might come to some harm of any sort that they essentially wrap them in bubble wrap, physically and emotionally, so that when suddenly they're turned loose on the world and something does harm to them, they lack, in many cases, the tools that they need to learn resilience. And resilience in that sense, what strengthens character, what strengthens morals, what strengthens an ethos is a repetition of that. Pedagogical experts tell us we learn best, for example, by making mistakes. Now, George, we don't want you as a physician making mistakes, and someone suffering because of them. And we said, oh, I learned something new. Thank you very much. Get going on. But in terms of the drills and so on, for example, I'm trying to relearn Spanish, but from a conversational point of view. And Lordy, I make lots of mistakes. When I'm using my app to learn, I get really upset because I'm a perfectionist. So I get really upset at myself when I make mistakes, but I realize that that's the only way I'm going to learn how to speak this language, is by choosing the wrong option and having the thing ding me that you chose the wrong option. That's not the right grammar. And so consequently, we learn in various ways. I've learned different languages that way. I've learned my own theology that way, where I went down this road and then suddenly realized that, oops, that's not really working out real well. And so I had to rethink. So one thing we don't want to do in our culture is rethink anything. We don't want to have to go backwards. It's not really going backwards. It's actually going forwards, because we have realized that the choice in the road there, when you do computer programs, there are these diagrams that you have to make choices, that you take this branch and you find out it doesn't get you where you want to go. Well, then you have to make some other choices to either go backwards or go forwards, but by a different route. If you use a GPS in your car, you'll sometimes hear recalculating, because you turned before or after they told you to, or you decided to take a shortcut that they didn't know about. And then, it's telling you that's actually telling you made a mistake. But they're working with you on that mistake. They're helping you get to where you want to go. And that's kind of what we need to do. So that was a very long way of saying that all of us then have to read the same scripture, whether it was second century followers of Jesus reading this rather philosophical text from the Apostle John, or a 21st century mind reading these same texts. And so that's what we're going to start out today with, that framework. Because what we're talking about in the 6th chapter, particularly with the first lesson that we're going to read on today, two very important miracles, or signs with a capital S, the great signs of the Gospel of John. Now, that's what we're going to talk about a little bit today from a broader perspective. We're going to read the text and look at it from what it actually says and what the great miracle was, because these two miracles actually then are what John expands on as he goes through the rest of this chapter. So we're going to start there. Let's do that first. Any comments before we get into the text?
Just a comment that the reading in the Old Testament has a similar miracle happening to a prophet. So
These
I
things
don't
are
know
not
what,
new.
and there's no explanation or development of it.
Right.
In John, you have a theological explanation and a lot more revelation, let's say, or explanation of the revelation that is in there.
And what we also have to do, and the thought just occurred to me, this might be helpful, is we also have to place John's philosophizing or theologizing about all of this in the context of the ancient Greek world, which was polytheistic. But John is not polytheistic. John is a monotheist. He believes in one God. And so miraculous interventions in the Greek world would have been seen as the interplay between the gods playing with each other, or the gods teasing with human beings that they're moving around on a chessboard. You know, that's the great epic poems by Homer, for example. So what John is also trying to do is move the thought patterns of these thinking people in this context into a way of understanding how there could be just one God, and that this person, Jesus of Nazareth, is not a demigod. He's not what in Greek terminology is called a theos aner, a God-man. A prime example that you would know of that would be Hercules, because he had two parents, one divine, one human. And at the time of John's writing, at the time of the early church, that was a very common understanding of Jesus. That Jesus was one of these theos aner, these God-human hybrids. And that it is only later, and actually it takes until the 4th century when we get a definitive explanation, or if you want to call it that, but a definitive statement that no, Christ is both, but fully both, not half and half. He's not a hybrid. He's fully human and fully divine. And that's what separates Christianity away from the mystery religions and so on. And that takes almost, it's 350 years before that is sort of, this is what we believe. And then it took another 50 or so years really for that to be worked out through the fabric of Christianity in the known world. So, that's the broader context for all of this. So when we hear this particular text, we have to keep all of that in mind. So let's do that. Let's go to as they say, go to the videotape. We're going to go to the text here. Let's see if I can find my share button. There it is. Okay, now we should be looking at the lectionary page. And here we are the proper 12, which is the designation in the RCL, the Revised Common Lectionary. We are in year B. And so here we go to the reading by John. So we're going to go directly to that because it's pretty pithy and very deep. John chapter 6 begins. Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. So Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. And when he looked up, he saw a large crowd coming toward him. Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" Jesus said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. But Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get even but a little. Now, one of his other disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what is that among so many?" So Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they all sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. Now, when the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." Now, when Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. Now, when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. And when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I. Do not be afraid." Then they wanted to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land toward which they were going. Here ends the lesson. Wow. A lot there. What strikes you?
Well, we've heard this story similar to it before, where they doubted that they could walk on water, and therefore they couldn't. But in this story, Jesus comes to them all the way to the boat.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is a little different. And then they arrive safely at the other side, so that it's a different kind of a take on this, where Jesus calms the tumult and in a miraculous way, I guess, so that it's one more lesson for his disciples to ponder.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that struck me was when he said, when Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. Pennsylvania Dutch, it wonders me why Andrew would even bother saying, "There's a boy here with some fish and bread," when he's already been told there's not going to be a sufficient way to feed. Is that just adding a build-up to the ultimate solution to the problem?
Possibly.
You know what struck me the most was after Jesus fed the 5,000, and there was a lot left over. He was tired. He had to go up in the mountain by himself.
Mm-hmm.
and then he came
Well,
down. So it's
Must have used
emphasizing.
up a lot of his energy.
Yeah. Well, I guess to make enough, I don't know how to describe it, to create or produce enough bread to feed and fish to feed 5,000 people is a lot of food.
Talk to the ECW about that.
Yeah.
But
But
other speculators have said that if you were going out to be with Jesus and be taught by him, you better take along some food with you. And that there may have been enough stuff carried in that when they really looked at it, everybody had something.
Yeah, that's actually William Barclay's take on it in some ways, that he said basically the way he ends his reflection on this particular portion is that the miracle wasn't so much that Jesus multiplied bread and fish, but he changed the hearts of people from being selfish to being generous.
Mm,
Yeah.
yeah.
This is one of those things where, when as we said before, I've had second thoughts about, because that's the way I used to explain this in sermons and so on. And I've actually had second thoughts about that.
Well,
I'm not so sure that that's the way to go. Carmen.
what struck me as I reread this, because it's a story that has been told in other gospels,
Mhm.
is that John begins by saying the need of the people, establishing that there was a need and they were following Jesus because they were in need of something. In this case, they were trying to get the signs.
And also
And yet,
here, Carmen, also here, Jesus isn't speaking a lesson. He is demonstrating a lesson as opposed to preaching.
what I see is that there's a need from them, and it seems like the response from Jesus is teaching them, and yet it's teaching and feeding. So it's not just fulfilling their expectations, but going beyond that. It's providing beyond just the teaching into the human need for food and other things.
well, and many of these people were probably peasants. They might not have had food to bring along. They basically lived from day to day.
And John, and just to put a fine point on that, which is what's causing me to have some second thoughts about my traditional explanation of all of this, is that John what struck me in some ways when I started studying this again was John makes clear that these are people who are pilgrims. They're in Jerusalem for Passover. So, it's like the Hajj. We just saw, many stories about the heat and so on in Saudi Arabia. But this is one of those pilgrimage festivals that people would come from all over Palestine and come to Jerusalem for the Passover. And so that explains a couple of things about the details in this story. One is, first of all, that there were so many people. Jerusalem is a big city, but to get 5,000 people to go out, and listen to some preacher was not going to happen on a regular basis. People were busy about their daily lives. But these are pilgrims. These are people on a religious quest. And so they're looking for something, and they hear about this itinerant preacher and all the great things that he's doing. And so they want to go out and see this great spectacle. So they may not have had the resources. When we think about taking a lunch, we think about taking it from home. Well, these were pilgrims. They were the ones who had to buy things in the marketplace so that they could just simply survive from day to day. And as it's been pointed out, they probably weren't necessarily very wealthy people. Notice what they're fed with, particularly the bread, is barley. Barley was the bread of the poor. wheat was expensive.
Mhm.
So you made bread from barley. You know, and barley has that sort of pungent flavor to it.
Mhm.
You know, we kind of like that kind of hearty bread in our modern age because we got tired of, you know, the white Wonder Bread kind of thing. But barley in this day and age was considered the bread of the poor. And so it's a poor boy that happens to have how he's got 5 loaves as a boy. I have no idea, unless he was carrying this for a couple of families. They had hired him to carry the knapsack, as it were, and a couple of fish. And again, fish was the way that people got protein in that day and age. Hence, the disciples were fishermen. That's why they were sort of, you know, the blue collar workers of their day.
And in
Because
Israel, to this day, you eat fish even for breakfast.
yes, well, lots of parts of the world we do that. You know,
Let's see.
I've gotten I rediscovered a taste for canned sardines. I know that's an odd thing, but yes, I know.
But that's very Portuguese.
Yeah. Well, I like them. I mean, I used to hate them, but now I like them. I don't know. You know, it's funny when you get older, your taste change. Judith, I'm sorry I interrupted you.
No, I was just going to say, this starts a lot like some of the other stories we read where Jesus is not fleeing the people so much as he wants a bit of rest. He wants to get away. So he crosses the sea. Therefore, these pilgrims, some of them may have been on that side of the sea, but some of them may have had to cross on boats. They were determined to follow him to the point that after they saw what he had done, they wanted to take him by force, and he had to flee again from the people.
Yeah.
It's a remarkable, the miracle story is remarkable in the setting.
And that's why, you know, the explanation that everybody brought a lunch and, you know, and Barclay's kind of said the real miracle is kind of thing. That's helpful in some ways, but I think it detracts from the genuinely miraculous notion that we see here. But we're gonna go into that a little bit as well, because it's very important.
Well, if you also looked at the going from Galilee to Jerusalem, that is not a easy short trip.
No.
That's I'm looking at a map here, and I'm going to say I know from Nazareth to Jerusalem is about 70 miles, so it's probably about 50 miles.
Well, the reality is, when you think about it that way as well, that the 5,000 were not necessarily in Jerusalem. They were on their way there.
Yeah. Well, if they were at the Sea of Galilee, they weren't in Jerusalem yet, but
Right.
that's a long, a long trek.
So, you know, they didn't just come from their houses, you know, with a candy bar in their pocket.
No.
Which is the way I used to describe it again. And I thought, you know, over time, I've said that's a kind of immature way of looking at it. And Barclay has a particular penchant for doing this. And in some ways I like it. In some ways it is counterproductive, depending on how you use this information. He wrote a book on the healing miracles. The way that he puts it is that the thesis of the book is basically being able to explain how a miracle might have, what we consider miraculous, may have occurred in more modern or more quote unquote skeptical or scientific terms, does not deny the nature of the event as miraculous. Because again, we have to situate it in its context. So even though we might, with modern understanding and modern knowledge, be able to explain something, it doesn't explain away the reality. So he tends to do this a lot in his writings and reflections. And again, he's not exegeting the scriptures as such in terms of trying to get the real meaning out of it. His daily study Bible series is, or daily Bible study series, is really a more of a spiritual / theological reflection on texts rather, but he uses a lot of poignant exegetical information, specific knowledge about the text and so on, that fills in some gaps in our own knowledge. But anyway, we have this trouble with miracles, you see. We don't like them. And that's why I referenced before we began in earnest this notion of the skeptical framework of the modern mind. Because in the ancient world, miracles would have been accepted as that. Extraordinary events beyond our explanation or beyond our understanding. And it doesn't mean that no one can understand it or no one can explain it. What it is that in the common understanding, common perception of it, it would have been super extraordinary or even supernatural. However, there is a way of understanding this, particularly when we start talking about the people with eyes of faith, that trying to explain it away or explain it in the way that I articulated to Barclay does, sort of takes away its special nature, but it also blinds us to the fact that the miraculous is all around us all the time. I explain it this way. When I was a kid, we used to go visit my mom's family in Buffalo. We lived in Albion, which was about an hour's drive away. And one of the nice things we used to do on a Sunday evening would, on our way back, my dad would stop because we passed the Buffalo airport. And back in those days, you could park on Union Road, and it was on the flight path. And the beginning of the runway was only several hundred yards away. Not even several hundred, maybe a couple hundred. So you would sit and watch the planes come in or take off, depending on, what situation, what the circumstances were. And when I look back at that, I realized that the awe that instilled in me was close to what people would be awed by in terms of a great work or a great sign or a miracle. It wasn't so much that it could not be explained, because if you're an engineer or an aeronautics engineer, you know exactly why that happens and what needs to happen to make that plane get in the air and so on. Proper speed, air drift, drag, all those different factors that engineers understand. But as a kid, I didn't understand it at all. My parents were adults, they didn't understand it at all. But we would just be awed by this phenomenon. I still get that way when I drive down to Rehoboth, to our place on the Delaware shore, and I go back by Andrews Air Force Base, and one of those C-130 transports is coming in. This massive hulk of a machine that sometimes is loaded down literally with tanks and armored vehicles goes into the air. It's just, you can hear the vibrations, the power of those engines. There's, I think, 6 engines, on each of them. And, they just put out this extraordinary amount of energy. And I always, much to the chagrin of my fellow travelers behind me and aside of me, I tend to slow down to watch this happen. Because it's on a highway. I'm on a highway and you can't pull over. So, you just have to kind of slow down because it's a long process. You can't land one of those things easily. They have to circle and circle, and then suddenly they start to come in, and it's a long, long, long approach. Otherwise, they would drop out of the sky like a rock. And to me, at the tender age of 68, almost 69, I still find that miraculous that thing can get off the ground. Ken, on the other hand, mi esposo, says that about these cruise ships that we go on. These massive hulks of metal and everything else there, hundreds of thousands of tons and it don't sink. It's like, it's just boggles the mind. Again, engineers understand all of the principles involved. And they make it happen. But that does not take away the awe that can be inspired by it. So when we look around ourselves, I've finally got back into the discipline of taking long walks. And we have a wonderful thing here in Harrisburg called the Green Belt. And we're near one of the entrances to the Green Belt. And so that's one of the places I like to take my walk. And again, through a combination of mindfulness and awareness and, trying to pay deliberate intentional attention to things, to see things that I would not have seen before. And the miracles of nature. That's the one thing about us modern humans, is we do not spend enough time in nature. There's a book that I read a few years ago, and I just haven't been able to bring myself to do this yet, but it's called, what is it called? The 3-Day Test or something like that. And basically what it is, it says, it's the narrative experience of several people who've done this, that it is to totally unplug and go into nature for 3 solid days. No phone, no modern contraptions and conveniences, just what you basically need to survive. Some food, a blanket, that sort of thing. And spend 3 days in nature. One of the narratives in this book actually talks about how this has been helping veterans with PTSD. The power of nature just to overwhelm us with awe puts us in touch with something in our soul that we often lack. So when we start talking about the miracles of Jesus, we have 2 important miracles here. One is the feeding of the 5,000. This is so important that this is the only miracle story that appears in all 4 Gospels. This is the only miracle, I repeat that, the only miracle story that appears in all 4 Gospels. The synoptics tend to have similar stories, and once in a while they will dovetail with John, but in this one case, the feeding of the multitude, do we get a version of this phenomenon, this story? So that's what points out how critically important this is for our understanding. Because it is a central event, phenomenon, if you will, miracle story, in the very fabric of who we are as followers of Jesus. So to simply, sort of poo-poo it and say, well, it happened and this is why, and I can explain it and all this kind of stuff, lacks the larger understanding that needs to be comprehended and apprehended by our minds and hearts. What is it that's going on here? And so it's important for us then to see a couple of things. I'm going to use an analogy right now. I'm going to say that this story is about our vestry. George went, what? I mean, look at it, really. You have Jesus saying, oh, where are we going to get the resources to feed all these people? And you have Philip. Well, with how many days' wages? We couldn't feed all of these people. What are you talking about? And then you have Andrew that says, well, I got a little bit here, but what good is that going to be? So when it comes to budgets and mission vision, all of a sudden everybody goes like, oh, well, we don't have enough. There's that theology of scarcity again. And what Jesus is doing here in one way is transforming that into an understanding of abundance. What does Jesus say in John's gospel about life?
And to help people understand that, he breaks the mold, breaks what has been done traditionally, which is counting how many fish and counting how many pieces of bread they had against what the need. And what's interesting is that somehow in providing something like that, people feel so satisfied that they want to make Jesus the king. But they have to break their mentality.
Yes. So when we think about this, we've got the bean counters, no pun intended, or the bread counters, or who are sitting at vestry meetings saying, oh, we can't do that. We can't afford that. And one of the things that I hope we have learned at St. Luke's is this: have the vision. Count on God to do it, not our own capacities. But see, vision is scary because it causes us to walk on water. Because suddenly we're being asked to do things outside, as Carmen just described, outside of our experience. Outside of, I have my nice little account boxes here, there, and everywhere. And we can afford that. But we can't afford that. I'm not saying to be silly or, because in another place in Matthew's gospel, Jesus says, what king goes to war without first counting the cost? But a failure of vision is what the disciples have here. Because notice what John says. Jesus said this because he already knew what he was going to do. Jesus knew that they were going to feed this lot somehow. And so Andrew and the little boy with the fish and the bread become the instrumental cause. They provide the stuff for Jesus. And in the hands of Jesus, here's a teaching if you want. In the hands of Jesus, little becomes much. Let's think about that from a Eucharistic perspective. We said at the outset that this is John's Eucharistic theology. What happens at Eucharist? What's supposed to happen at the Eucharist?
Well,
What's most people's? Go ahead.
we receive bread and wine that are sanctified and transformed into the body and blood of Christ. And it is for renewal, strength.
Eucharistic prayer C. There you go.
Well, I know that one fairly well.
Yes. Well, actually, I'm going to critique that, not negatively, but you began with we receive. What's the first thing that happens at Eucharist? Literally, the first thing.
We praise
We receive the wafer.
No. No, you talk about in the Eucharistic.
In the liturgy.
In the liturgy, we talk about the
We
history.
bless.
We bless. Yeah. Um,
We come.
we come. Oh,
That's the first thing. We arrive. We sit down on the grass. And then, of course, we receive, we've talked about this before, the dialogical nature of the liturgy and so on. I mean, we can do a little liturgical theology course on that, but we only receive, quote unquote, at the end.
Mhm.
What happens first is that we come and then we give what we have. There's a reason why the bread and wine are presented from the people. We're the little boy. This is all I have.
Mhm.
A little bread and a little wine. And then it's blessed, broken, and given. The process of transformation isn't only over the elements of the Eucharist, the bread and the wine. That process of transformation is equally about us. Because what do we bring when we come?
every bit of baggage that we have.
Critique again. Not so much the baggage, but the gifts. The Spirit has anointed us, and we each have gifts, but we think that they're too little for the need. And yet when we come and we assemble, each of our respective and diverse gifts of the Spirit is assembled into one whole body. And it is there that the abundance of God is seen. And so that abundance then feeds us with the little morsel of bread and the sip of wine. And then we are told, go. Take what you have received and do this in the world. Go thou and do likewise. Too often in the Christian church, particularly at the high liturgical churches, we see this as going to communion, to go get something, rather than to go give something. And what do we get? Very often, if that's our mindset, it's about we, and it's this, we only have so much and so little and so on. I know I take a little liberty. I'm at this long enough that I think I have the right to do that because I think it's good theology, frankly. But when I receive the financial offerings of the congregation, I will take them to the altar and I say, these are the gifts of the people of God for the work of the church of God. May they be fruitful and multiply. For all things come of thee, O God, and of thine own have we given thee, is the prayer book versicle. And that's when I say those things, what I'm trying to do is just click into people's minds a little bit that your giving of your financial offering isn't the end of it. It's only the beginning. It's the seed planting. And it is the mission vision of the church. And in a concrete world, meaning a physical world, that is lived out in a parish community. What do you think? Do you think that's legitimate to think about that with this story?
Yeah.
Well, thanks for that.
I would say that vision of scarcity connects in my mind, and my mind, I know, sometimes have quickly jumped with the bell. I was not accustomed to hear a little bell when the bread was consecrated or the wine. But there's a little bell in the church when you do that.
Mhm.
And
That's
it
your big
began
bell, it's
to be,
outside.
well, but for reading Sister Joan Chittister, about the meaning of bells for her as a nun, I began to realize this is like you're calling attention to something. And the Anglican tradition probably gets enriched by those warnings. I would say that if there's any teaching done during the service or mass, it's because there are some little bells telling you, hear this,
Pay attention.
pay attention to this,
Mhm.
notice that. And you don't use enough bells.
Oh my God, most
But
of the
if-
congregation would string me up if I started using bells the way we used to.
But
But-
let me say that because I'm not a cradle Anglican, I
Uh-huh.
notice them. And it's precisely those calling attention to something that helped me pay attention, watch it, think of this.
In
And,
the Go ahead, sorry.
and the math becomes a teaching help
Yes.
precisely because I'm not familiar with it enough. I have not memorized it. And so what happens is that the little bell wakes me up to the fact that this is a holy moment.
Mhm.
This is a special moment. Watch out.
And we even, in many churches, the bell is rung just inside the church. We actually ring one of the tower bells. What you're hearing is one of the tower bells ringing, which
Right.
tells the world that something important is happening here.
And in this case, people did not have anything. And all of a sudden they received something. Everybody was telling, there's nothing here. And yet they get enough for everybody.
Right. Exactly. It is the transformative power that we're talking about here, from scarcity to abundance, from mundane to miraculous. Whatever transfiguration we need to think about and meditate on to get the deeper meaning here. Go to it. The use of the bell, for example, it hails from the old Latin Mass where, people didn't know what was going on because it was in a language you didn't understand, and you'd ring the bells because something important was happening. So everybody should be quiet and pay attention. But if you go to the Orthodox,
I remember the moment in the Cinema Paradiso where the priest scolds the little guy because he's not ringing the bells at the proper time.
yeah. I was that little guy. We had a very old priest who was probably somewhat senile. When I was a young altar server, he used to come and he used to say a private mass after the high mass on Sunday. And being, junior, I had to stay and serve his mass. And he would mumble in such a way because he was old, and that we didn't, and he didn't kneel, genuflect properly, because again, he was just couldn't do it. And so one day, me and my comrade were there, and we thought we were at the Sanctus, and we're ringing the bells, and he just turned around and gave us holy hell because we were ringing the bell at the wrong time. So it was very much that way. Anyway, but this notion of what's happening at liturgy is, going back to Brueggemann's comment, if you really understand what's happening here, you need a crash helmet. Because the power here is the same power that fed 5,000 people with 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. That's what we're doing. And it's at our disposal. But because our perspectives are ones of scarcity, we are afraid of what the abundance might mean for us. And so we retreat into our little hobbit holes, in a sense, where we're just sort of looking for the crag in the mountain. We're looking for protection. We're always looking for stuff from God. How come we don't want to ever give anything to God? I'm not saying that people are not generous. I don't mean that. But from the point of view of an attitude of heart, even when we come down to stewardship campaigns and annual membership, campaigns in terms of pledging and all that sort of thing, I know how people go about this. How much can I afford? That comes from scarcity. If the question is, how much shall we give? And that's the first question. Then you can go about and figure, you have to be reasonable. You have to pay the rent or, the mortgage and all that kind of stuff to be sure. So you can't give away the farm, quite literally, unless you want to. But the point is that you begin from first principles. And beginning from those first principles changes how you view things. So that's when we see this narrative begin. After this, Jesus went to the other side of the sea, also called Sea of Tiberias. Large crowd kept following him, blah, blah, blah. And he said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. How many times when mission vision comes to us and it is articulated for us, and then we sit back and we go like, I don't know about that. I don't think we can afford that. That's not reasonable. Are we then saying, sorry, Jesus, we're not going to participate in this miracle? So this becomes an interesting, coming together, use a normal word, coming together of various threads here about the Eucharist, about stewardship, about discipleship, about the cost of discipleship. I don't mean financial, I mean in terms of our lives. That this is all about changing our mindset so that we begin to see God's work everywhere. And if we see God's work everywhere, then the miracles aren't so unusual. We begin to expect them. And I don't mean supernatural events, but rather we see the miraculous in the mundane, in the everyday. I go outside and I see a flower and suddenly awe strikes me. I was on one of my nature walks recently and there's a stream that runs through this particular portion. And I just was staring at it and all of a sudden I saw fish that were so well camouflaged against the brown mud background and stones that had they not moved, I would not have seen them. But then I began to realize that there weren't just a couple, there were tons of them. Imagine that with this. I just see 5 loaves, Andrew says, but Jesus sees abundance, tons of bread.
May I make a comment about the crowds also?
Absolutely.
The crowds kept coming, they kept following because they saw the signs he was doing for the sick. But do we know that they brought the sick with them? Did they know even what they were seeking?
No. The sick are not mentioned in this crowd.
Right. But it's like it says the crowd kept following because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick.
They had no expectation of lunch.
Right. Did they have any inkling of of any kind of expectation, except that they saw him as possibly a prophet?
They saw him as a theos on air, a God man that worked marvelous things. And so I want to see this for myself. Could be one of the motivations. Maybe I myself need something from this powerful man. Maybe I heard that he is a very insightful teacher, so I want to get some. It's always I want to get something.
And one of the things that I have noticed, maybe I'm paying more attention, is that human need is bigger than we're aware of. Every time I have had the opportunity to be with other people, this week, I have noticed different kinds of needs. Sometimes it's healing, and sometimes it's just having a new job or a family situation. And when you try, you discover that there are so many needs around you that it's overwhelming. And so when I read it this morning, I was thinking, this is just the gospel reminding us that human need is all around us if we pay attention, and that many of these people might not even have clear in their mind what is it that you need. Like in the gospel story that we saw about this man that Jesus himself said, well, what do you need? We don't even name it or realize it.
Right.
I remember one time I was working, and someone who was at that time the director of our prayer ministry came into my office and said, Carmen, I need to pray for you. Yeah, okay. We closed the door and she prayed for me. And it was only after she finished the prayer that I felt lighter. I was not aware that I had any burden or any concern in particular. You have the regular concern, the yeah, yeah. But I felt like someone has lifted something from me, even when I didn't know that. And it was only when she began to pray for me that I realized, oh, maybe I needed this. Maybe it was the human touch. Maybe have been someone cares about me. Maybe I don't know, but it was a release.
A similar thing has happened on repeated occasions. And I think I'm going to miss this on a regular basis. From Mother Mary. When she'd be in the office, and sometimes she would just see me struggling with something in the parish, whether it was a personnel issue or finances or a parishioner, particular problematic issue or something. She saw, she can see my furrowed brow, or, she knows me well enough now over these years to know when something is on my heart heavy. And she would come in and she would just say, stand up. And she would take my hands and she would pray. And the prayer was very simple, usually. Just a prayer of deliverance or prayer of guidance. She didn't even know sometimes what she was praying for. From the point of view that she just knew, she perceived need. But your other point, I think, is extremely helpful and very, very important. That when we look at the sea of humanity, the need is overwhelming, and we all are Philip. With 6 months' wages, we could not feed them. So we are not even going to try. That's the ... after his statement. We are not even going to try. What good is this, Jesus? And the point is, with God, you must try. Just start somewhere, even if it's only with 5 barley loaves. Just start. And I'm hoping that, in this period of St. Luke's history, we've learned that. At least a bit. When we talked about hiring another minister for children and family ministries. Oh, no, we can't afford that. Barely can afford paying your salary, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, well, let's give this a try. And whenever I face vestry skepticism about that sort of thing, I always love to, and Carmen will understand this particularly. I go back to the Council of Gamaliel. which was in the Acts of the Apostles when the Sanhedrin was really upset with this furtive Christian community causing, strife in the synagogue communities because of this Jesus risen from the dead person. Gamaliel says, listen, don't get so upset about it. I mean, these are my words, not his. But this is the important piece. If it's not of God, it will die. Don't worry about it. If it is of God, you can do nothing to stop it. And I go back to that all the time. That's what can give us as a community confidence to move forward, that if we are really seeking to discern the will of God in all of this, our God is a God of abundance. And I don't mean the Joel Osteen kind of abundance. I'm talking about the fact that when we come together, when we assemble, you look at there and you've got people of every age and diversity of gift. And that if we all put down our fear, then we are powerful, because we are exercising the transformative power of Christ, as Jesus did in this story. Any other comments about that?
One comment concerning what Judy had said. If I were going on a virtual pilgrimage and I and my wife, I'm not going to leave my mother-in-law back home who can't hardly get up out of bed. We take her with us. And so when we were in there and we meet the great man, she is there too. And so there may be an opportunity for another miracle on the way. And I would think they had no caretakers. If they wanted to do a thing like this, they had to bring the lame along with them. Otherwise, they would be left at home to die.
True. And it's more than likely the way it all worked out.
Yeah. I mean, it's just a practical matter.
Well, but also a spiritual matter.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting. And then, to kind of begin to close us out here, that is part of this lesson. And part of the narrative is we have this thing inserted about Jesus walking on the water. This is another story of transformation, is it not? Because the disciples are in the boat and there's a storm. And as we've talked about before, storms that come up on the Sea of Galilee are like lake storms. They get pretty wild very fast. And so the disciples are rowing heroically to try to get the ship to shore, as it were. And all of a sudden, someone appears to them. That someone is Jesus. They are frightened. I mean, I've been in that situation. You get really scared because your life is on the line. Or theoretically could be. And for them, the sight of Jesus, what does Jesus say to them?
It is not, do not be afraid. That
there it is. There it is. And they wanted to take him into the boat, and immediately, the boat reached the land to which they were going. There it went. They didn't have to row anymore. Another great miracle. That's part of the miracle we don't see. We tend to emphasize the walking on water, but they were in the middle of the lake or the sea, and then suddenly they find themselves on the shore. How did that happen? We have no explanation for that. None is necessary. But the point, what was the transformation here? From fear to joy or relief, if you will. Because now, I mean, they're on terra firma. They know they're fine. That would give me some joy. And so this notion, again, of being afraid, when we're left to our own devices, whether it's faced with the vast sea of human need or actual threat to our well-being, what's the key?
Faith, trust in Jesus.
There you go. Faith is based on our trust in God. Do we trust God? That goes back, again, on a very practical level when we start talking about things. If we do things in a way that are at least rational, they're not irrational, but seemingly beyond our capacities. And the two things are different. Why is it that we're always afraid? This is what I hear now when we look at our demographics, our financial situation in the parish and so on. We may not be here in 10 years. That is the quintessential expression of what? Fear.
Yeah.
And I just simply say to people, and they think I'm just sort of, in la la land sometimes, leave it to God. But I mean, really leave it to God, not just pay lip service to it. Oh, we depend on God. No, actually place yourself into the hands of God. Take it, in a different telling of the walking on water, we see Peter get out of the boat. And it's only when he realizes what his circumstances are that he starts to fail. But when his eyes are on Jesus, and he says to Jesus, if it's really you, call to me to come to you. And Jesus says, well, then come. And Peter gets out and he's walking on water until he realizes, what am I doing here? And boom, down he goes like a rock. And what happens? Of course, Jesus grabs him by the arm and pulls him up. So even in our insecurity, even in our fear, Christ is there. But we can do marvelous things if we have that fundamental faith and trust. I won't even say faith, because faith gets mixed in with doctrine and all that sort of thing. Trust. Trust. And how do we manifest trust in God? This is the rub. By manifest, how do we make it concrete? How do we make it real, physical, that we can see it and touch it?
By our actions and our
You're getting there.
and by how we live.
Where is the trust manifest? Where do you actually see the trust at work?
And moving forward.
In our relationship with others and in service.
I wouldn't even go be in service by
In our
simply
faith.
trusting one another.
Yeah.
God, Jesus tells us, love one another as I have loved you. How can you love somebody you don't trust? To the point where you make yourself totally vulnerable. That's what, as I have loved you.
Can I suggest another way of looking at this?
Sure.
I grew up in a place where being a Catholic was the normal, but I grew up Protestant. And one of the things that I learned about my Protestantism was that I had to know where I stand. And I participate in an Episcopal church right now, even when I'm a United Methodist ordained minister, and I have been in the higher levels of the church because I like what I see. But I'm not sure that everybody there at the church knows how beautiful a service you have, how beautiful an Anglican church can be, an Episcopal church can be. You have to believe, love, and affirm who you are in order to be there. And I would say, again, I'm not a cradle Anglican, I'm not a cradle Episcopal, but I have come to enjoy what I see. And by enjoying what I see and affirming what I see, you have a wonderful preacher, by the way. One of the things that I have come to appreciate is unless you're convinced of something, unless you know who you are, it's very difficult to stay the course. And it's precisely in that loving what you see. I enter the church and it's beautiful. It's the witness of so many generations of people who love the church enough to make it beautiful. And the liturgy is the beauty of people who have been thinking about how to express some things. And it's that love of who you are and what you do that can make a difference, because it's contagious.
It is.
While our physical church is a thing of beauty, it's a jewel, really, in Lebanon, and I think even in our diocese. To me, its beauty pales against the beauty of the people that inhabit it. And the reason I say that is this. When we were making the little video that we did for our capital campaign, I interviewed 5 of our young kids. And I think it was it Alex or Connor? No, I can't remember. Anyway, but the younger of the Sedelnik children, of the boys, doesn't speak much. He's not a outgoing person. He's more of a introvert in some ways. I talked to his mother about it, and she said, "Not on your life," but that's at least the way I perceive him. And when you watch this video, every time I watch it, it brings me to tears, because in the very end of it, he says this. He says, I love St. Luke's because everyone is wanted here. I mean, out of the mouths of babes. That video starts with George's reflection, one of the older people in our congregation, who was talking about when he and Betty first came, and that it was the people that really convinced them to stay. I mean, they loved the architecture and all that sort of thing, but that it was the people that said, yeah, I think this is the place for us. And then to have it capped off at the very end, again, without prompting, this was not prompted at all. This is not scripted. To have him, I mean, some of the other kids said, well, there's wonderful things to do. We have mass, we have Sunday school, but when he said, everyone is wanted, that was the key. And just to use that context, when we were planning this capital campaign, our consultant, Jerry Kuchar, and I were sort of the same mind. I mean, I'm the one who brought him on board because I do respect his work so much and I trust him. When he told the committee how much money he thought they could raise, they all thought he was crazy. And yet, we have reached, we're only a few dollars away from not only our regular or the standard goal, but our stretch goal. And that doesn't count the wonderful work that our friend George did in the memorial to Betty by giving us the new lighting system. If you add that on top of it, I mean, we're talking nearly $1 million. And there are people who look at us and go like, where does that come from? Again, 5 barley loaves and 2 fish in the hand of Jesus is transformative. And you see what's happening all around us now as these projects start to come to fruition, that it's a new day. It's a new chapter. There will be life coming. God is getting us ready for something. I don't know what it is. I'm one of the people sitting on the grass. I'm not quite sure how I'm going to get fed yet. But I've seen and heard what he did somewhere else, namely in our own community in a previous age. But now post-COVID, we're in a totally different world. So I don't know what that's going to look like. But I have every confidence that we will flourish if we continue down the path of being disciples of Jesus and trusting in Jesus. That's all that's required. That's all.
Can I make a comment on a slightly different note?
Sure.
On Sunday in the dining room, there was political discussion going on. And people like to sit at my table. I don't know why. And I was so depressed when I got up from the table. As I wandered out of the room, 2 ladies came over to me. And they said, "We like to hear you talk." And so I couldn't describe my feelings. I felt like I was going to cry. And so that as I went to my apartment, as I sometimes do in my selfish way, I prayed that God to give Joe the wisdom to do the right thing. And a half hour later, he did. So I thought that was pretty good service.
Well, because George, you
Real
were not
power.
alone. You were not alone. There were many, many people praying in that
Yes.
way.
Yeah.
You may have been isolated in your own circumstance.
We're still recording.
Yes, that's fine. But you were not alone, because this is a spiritual teaching here. You were not alone in praying that an individual in leadership, isn't that what we do at the Prayer of the People every week? We pray for wisdom and guidance for the leaders of government and so on. That's not just lip service. We want them to do what they would imagine and that we can agree with would be, quote unquote, the right thing. Now, whether or not it's the politically expedient thing or whether or not it's what our political desires are is a different question. But that people would follow wisdom and would follow what seems to be, I think the one thing that Joe Biden did do this weekend, regardless of your political persuasion, was demonstrate humility. And I think this comes from his deep Catholic faith. I think it comes from his Christian discipleship. That there are things bigger than me, and I must do what is necessary, at least as I perceive those things, to do what I need to do to bring those things about. Now take that teaching and apply it to the kingdom of God. I don't mean that the government is the kingdom of God. I don't mean that. But rather, we can look at this call to establish the kingdom of God, and we can say it's all about us. You know, I'm a rector. I'm the pastor of, you know, one of the largest and most influential and prestigious parishes in the Diocese of Bethlehem. And yet I could, be kind of puffed up about that. And sometimes I am, to be perfectly honest. But I said this to Vestry when we made the transition from being priest in charge to rector. And Kathy, you may remember this. I said, I will not remain. I mean, at the time, that was 5 years ago or something. I said, I'm getting older, and this is pre-COVID. This place is starting to pop in so many different ways. I may not be able to handle it. And the day that I determine that I can no longer do that, I will resign to take a smaller parish, or I will simply retire, depending on when that is. And the vestry said, no, you can't do that. I said, oh, yes, I can, and I will. Because we always have to recognize there is something greater than ourselves. And we are in service to that greater value, regardless of what it is. Whether it's a small ministry within the parish, or whether it's leading the parish itself, whether it's about the larger question about the kingdom of God in our society. Whatever moves that mission forward is what we all have to decide is our role and place. And I think too often we get caught up in being Philip. I don't have enough. There's not enough here for me to make any difference, or be overwhelmed with fear as the disciples in the boat. But always the one thing I can be grateful for, and I am grateful for each day in my prayers, is the fact that I have been given the gift of that confidence in Christ. And so every time I have to make a hard decision in leadership, that's the first thing I do. Not all my co-leaders in the parish are like that. And sometimes they think I'm nuts. And sometimes I have to assert myself as the pastor, because I'm seeing things from that perspective and not from the Philip side of things, or even the Andrew side of things. I have some leaders that are Andrew. Well, we can try, but we've only got this little bit, I said, fine, give me the little bit and we'll see what happens. I'm not Jesus, but in the hands of Jesus, it happens. That's why we gather at the Eucharist. And we'll plumb this thing about the Eucharist more and more and more and more, because it is a central element of who we are as disciples. Any final comments?
It's time to eat.
Okay.
See you in 2 weeks.
All right. All
I
right.
think
Take
I'm
care,
gonna miss
everybody.
it. It should be interesting.
All right. Take care. Have a good week.
Bye-bye.